first of all, my name is Tina Gaznarez, and I'm a Fort Wayne native, born and raised. And it was a kind of a nice experience for me because I grew up with 11 brothers and sisters. I'm one of 12. I'm number 8 in the ranks, so I'm way down in the ranks there. But that afforded us kind of a nice opportunity in our family. We were a group of creative types, and we would put on shows, skits, things like that for our family, for some of the younger siblings and some of the older siblings. And we were always just putting on these random skits in our house. So creativity was something that was really alive and well in our home. And that actually grew out of our watching films at any time, whether we were going to see Walt Disney films in the movie theaters. And something that really stuck out with me were some of the films that at the old Rialto at the corner of Pontiac and Calhoun Street. That was a theater that actually showcased a lot of wonderful black films. That's how I was exposed to Buck and the Preacher, and also some really interesting, whether it was Superfly, just so many great black-themed films. And the reason why Buck and the Preacher really stands out for me is because I was already a long-time Sidney Poitier fan. And I'll just share really quickly that I became a fan, and I have the memory very vividly. I watched To Sir with Love on television. It was on network television. I must have been maybe 5 years old. And I watched the film, and I sat right in front of the large console television. And as I watched it, I just fell in love with Sidney Poitier. I don't know what it was, but it was just something about this gentleman. And here he is. He's a teacher, and he's teaching these students, and they're having all these problems. Had no idea what it was about. I just remember at the end of the film, I started crying because Sir, the teacher, Sidney Poitier, was about to take leave, and he was going to leave the school. And they had the big dance for him. And I remember I started bawling, wailing. And my mom, she said, "Are you crying, Tina?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm crying." And yeah. And she said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because he's leaving." And she just looked and said, "Oh my gosh." So it was from that moment on, anything by Sidney Poitier, I wanted to watch it. So that's how it started for me. And I actually got the chance to see Buck and the Preacher at the Rialto Theater when I was a kid, a few years later. And I just remember it hit on all the points for me as someone who loves history. I was developing my love of history anyway, but it was the first time I'd actually seen black actors in a role that was actually set in the West. And that actually grew into today. I love black cowboy history, the West, the frontier, and all of those elements that are displayed in this film. Ruby Dee is a big fan. I'm a big fan of her work. And it was just amazing on so many levels. And I love the fact that this was Sidney Poitier's directorial debut. This was his first film that he directed. And it was by accident. So I loved what he was able to put together. And it was just so interesting. So that's my story. And I've been a fan ever since.
Well, those of you who are interested in joining the conversation, you can do so either. There's a mic over here in the corner if you'd like to ask a question directly, or you can join us through Slido. But Tina, one of the things I really love about your story and what brings you with us tonight is that you have a really long history with Cinema Center that has now brought you to our board. Can you talk a little bit about your history with our organization?
Sure. Because I am a Fort Wayne native, I've known about Cinema Center, and I was always drawn anyway to storytelling in a unique way. Mm-hmm. And so since I was maybe in my early 20s, I just enjoyed coming to the theater over the years, and I actually became a member at one point, and I just enjoyed just coming. I always just enjoyed the films here. And the storytelling, I think the independent storytelling is what was the draw for me. And so much so that I actually introduced my daughter when she was just 10 years old to her first independent film. And I brought her here, and she's been a fan ever since. And she's 30 now, so 20 years ago. And it was just something that I believe in storytelling and being creative, and it made so much sense to me. So when I got the opportunity, and by the way, I was connected to Cinema Center by participating as a volunteer with the Hobnobbing Film Festival. Since its inception, I've participated in some way. I just tell everyone, just put me to work, I'll help. And that grew into one day.
I know that to be true.
You know what I mean? Just what do you need? But what I loved about it too was I was invited to consider serving on the board of directors here at Cinema Center, and I didn't need any coaxing. I just, sure, absolutely, I'll do it. And I'm so happy I did. So it's been wonderful.
So with Sidney Poitier's passing recently, in terms of, kind of a life well lived and a legacy, can you talk to us a little bit about that actor and the now chance to reflect on his life and his contribution?
Oh, sure. I think what I loved about his story is, first of all, he came to this country from the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was an immigrant to this country. And he grew up in humble beginnings. And the fact that he ended up in New York and he had a dream and it was something he wanted to do, I thought it was quite interesting. It's a wonderful story when you think about here in this country and about what a black man, and I will say a black man, was able to achieve under the constraints of what was happening over his lifetime, right? When you think of segregation, when you think of all of the things that were taking place, Jim Crow, I mean, just what was happening in the South and all. And the fact that he persevered and that he not only achieved success, it was so long-lasting. It was so long-lasting. I think that's what I always enjoyed about him, even when he pretty much went into the directorial avenue of his career. The films that he put out there were also just wonderful, and he was good at storytelling, but he was also good at telling a story. And I think that was something, and I think he did it with such grace, and he did it in a way where it stayed with you. And I think even with this particular film, it's a Western, and I know that I'd read somewhere that people actually labeled this as a black Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And I said, no, what are you thinking? No, it's not. Don't do that. Because I think we have to look at the historical context within this film. And you saw those moments and glimpses of this taking place when you heard Ruby Dee talking to Buck, and when she was telling him she wants to go to Canada. She didn't want to be in the United States, and she talked about why, right?
Yeah.
And then looking at the storytelling, and I think as the director, even though, what I found very interesting, yes, he was an immigrant to this country, where prior to his even coming to this country, he probably did not experience the level of discrimination and that sort of thing. And here he is now in this new land, and he's navigating to great success, but he was still a black man. And I think that with Sidney Poitier able to present this story in a way where you could definitely see the elements, whether it was the Native Americans and then the black experience and what was happening even with that aspect, I thought it was really interesting. And I think it was worth noting in the story, in the film, that it was one that needed to be addressed. Mm-hmm. That Buck was a Union soldier. He did kill. He did participate. But what was the goal? When you looked at these newly freed people, and here they were just trying to carve out their own level of autonomy, freedom. They didn't want to go back. And when the gentleman in the story, when they said, well, do you want to go back? And he said, well, we don't have no food. We'll die in the snow. That's how profound it was, I think, for these individuals to try to find something. And I think Sidney Poitier was the best director to be able to share and to present that story. I thought it was great.
Well, and as you mentioned, which is so important to both the backstory and the front story of this film, because there's two really interesting stories, right? There is the backstory of this film and what ends up on film. But one of the things that's really compelling is, while kind of the blaxploitation genre,
Yeah.
he gets to direct this film, but he gets to direct it, as you said, kind of by accident.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, can you talk a little bit about the having that voice, not only just representation on film, but representation as storyteller?
Oh, sure. When you mentioned blaxploitation and the genre itself, it just simply means that it was during this very shortened period in cinema history when storytelling took a new approach, where black figures, black characters had a more profound voice in cinema, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, what happened was you had people who wanted to see black individuals presented in a more positive light, as opposed to, say, if you think of the film, and one of my favorites is Tamara Dodson is her name, and she was Cleopatra Jones. And that was a story that, she was a CIA operative and she knew karate. And I saw that film and I just said, wow. For a little kid like me watching her film, then I thought it was amazing. But on the downside of that genre was something like Superfly, where you had a pimp. You had, abuse of women. You had, all of these things that were taking place. And the groups that really came out and criticized these films, they had a problem with that. They said, yes, it's good to see an all-black cast, but at what point, it's wrong. We can't do this. So over time, those films went away. So I kind of label, if you will, when I watch Buck and the Preacher, I see some of the same elements, and I'll say it, where I can counter and take away. There is no exploitation of the black figures, the black characters, but one thing I did see was empowerment. When you think about Buck, when you think about the people who were newly freed and on their way to this new land to settle, and I thought that was something. But when you watch some of the films, even like with Cleopatra Jones, it has that same sort of element, very empowering to see a woman in this position. Here she had this massive afro, she's wearing heels, and by the way, she was 6'2", and 6 foot 2 inches tall. So she was actually, she started her career as a model, and went right in there. And by the way, who encouraged her to get into acting? Mr. Sidney Poitier encouraged her to get into acting, and she did. And this is how she did it. So she always, there was something very graceful about her characterization of Cleopatra Jones. So I think that's part of what I'm seeing when I mention blaxploitation, not in the caricature sort of way, but what was the lasting message? There was something about the empowerment or the figures who were featured. And that was very much, and when you look at the period in the 1970s, what was happening in our country, they were speaking to that. They were speaking to that through cinema.
I love the focus on stories, and it's funny. It's very clear that we got first Slido question, and it's very clear that somebody here likes your taste, because the question is, what other movies would you recommend, and what other movies did you consider when I came to you with, and I'll be honest, when we started this with our theme of Black Joy for February, and I was like, okay, Tina, what are we going to talk about when we talk about Black Joy? And so what are some other movies you'd recommend, and what were the other ones you were thinking about when you were putting this together?
Well, I knew I wanted, especially because by the time you'd asked me, Sidney Poitier had passed away. Just a good long life, for heaven's sakes. And I initially thought about To Serve with Love,
Wow.
just because I think it's just classic. My kids actually gave me the VHS of that film for Christmas one year, and I still have it just because I bawled even then. Oh, look at this is so nice. So it's wonderful. So that would be great. And also I do like In the Still of the Night with Sidney Poitier. And there's again that period. What was happening during that time, the late 1960s, and it's such a powerful film that hits on all cylinders when you think about what was taking place in our country and how they were asking, do this sort of thing. So if we're going to stay in the black genre filmmaking, those are some of my favorites. I love Sounder with the late, great Cecily Tyson. She was also a phenomenal actress, a great voice for the people, for us. When I watched that film, again, here it was a sharecropping family and the trials that they went through and how she just stood out in that film because her husband, once he is taken away and in prison, she has to then run that entire farm with her children and trying to make things work. And it's an amazing, incredibly told story for sure. Really, really cool. So those are just a few of my favorites. I do love Westerns. I know that for me, I do like spaghetti Westerns. One of the earliest films that I remember watching was Once Upon a Time in the West with Henry Fonda, Charles Bronson, Jason Robards. That's another one of my favorites. I watched that. It's maybe it runs maybe 2.5 hours to almost, it's a long film. But the score, the soundtrack is amazing. The mouth that they're speaking in Italian, some of the other characters, but Henry Fonda is there, and and he's the bad guy, and it's just a brilliant film. I just love good. I can just sit and watch it every time. I have the DVD for that one as well. So just because sometimes I pop it in, and I just want to just sit and just
Watch
go
a good
away.
movie.
So it's really cool. Yeah, for sure.
Now, it's funny because you talk about what's going on at the time and the movie being enmeshed in the time. But one of the things that strikes me also about Sidney Poitier was that he wasn't afraid to be a voice in the time. Matter of fact, he was highly political.
Yes.
And we're enmeshed kind of in this moment in our culture about, should the artist speak? Should we hear from artists when it comes to politics? And I'm wondering how you feel about not just the stories on the screen commenting on culture, but the artists themselves and the role they play in our conversation.
Absolutely. Sidney Poitier was a really outspoken civil rights activist. He really was. And he used his platform where he easily could have just, listen, you have your Academy Award, you're well paid, you don't have to do any of that. But he used his position as an actor to really make things happen. And interestingly, Harry Belafonte, who was featured in the film with him, right? It's so good. Then they actually started out together in New York. They met when they were about 24 years old, and they had a 70-year friendship up until the time he had passed away, and they had continued that. But there are some old photos at the when Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, and they're on at the Washington Monument there, and he. There are photos of them, and they were right there in the thick of things. They're lending whatever they could to help to get the message out. What do you need from us? So they were very much a part of that. And I think Sidney Poitier, where so many people nowadays, you think, no, you don't have a voice, but this man was an American citizen, and rightly so. You're in the middle of what is happening and what's taking place. You do have a right to say something. And just something that really quickly, when he was making In the Still of the Night, there were those moments. He actually told his wife and children, you're not coming down south. You stay where you are. During the filming of that movie, you're not coming down here. So it impacted him in a very profound way. So I thought that was something, and I think that's something that needs to be recognized, I think. The fact that he used his platform, people knew who Sidney Poitier was, and he did something. He spoke out. He used his voice, right? And I think in his presence, in his name, to really kind of bring forth what was taking place throughout our country during those really tumultuous periods. So I think it's a good thing.
I keep thinking, unfortunately, those tumultuous periods have not ended.
No way. No, that's true. That's true.
The tumult still exists right here with us at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think, if nothing else, conversations, I wanted this movie to be seen. I don't know how many people had actually seen the film, but it's one of my favorites, and I feel like sometimes will share information like on my social media feed. oh, have you seen this film? And some people will ask about different films, and I don't look away. And that's something I think that needs to be addressed. When the film starts, you see how they talk about the unmarked graves and of the people who set forth. And you think about it, you want to connect the dots, take a look at, Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that didn't just spontaneously become this, the Black Wall Street. I had an opportunity to visit there last summer. My husband and I took a road trip, and we were on our way to Texas and to see our kids. And then we stopped, and I said, we're going to spend time here. And I walked around Black Wall Street, looked at buildings, went to the Greenwood History Center and learned more about the history, how it started. And it was much like what happened here, just where you have a group of people, freed people, who saw a vision and said, this can be ours. And they did that. And I found the story, I walked away, I didn't talk for a few hours because I was just listening and watching and reading and wanting to understand. And of course, with the Tulsa massacre is what I call it, because I think when you say riot, it makes it seem like there are two groups that are fighting one another. These people it was unprovoked, and this is what was going on, but their stories, the stories of the survivors, people who were children at the time, and they remember what they were seeing. And I found that very, very interesting, and they had photos, and then they had their very brief memory. And it was really interesting, and it really hit home for me.
Well, and it was pop culture again that drew that back into our conversation, right? With The Watchmen on HBO, that
Yes.
we're gonna really talk about this in a way that's meaningful. That because so much of that history had been erased,
Yes.
right? It's not like it was forgotten.
Yes.
There was an active erasing of this in our conversation. And so it took another pop culture moment to pull that into our conversation.
Absolutely. Our history, and I say this all the time, U.S. history is our history. I studied history at Purdue Fort Wayne. I was fortunate to really engage with some really wonderful professors, and two of which I think are here actually. And I see hi, Professor Carr, Professor Woodward, good to see you. But what I loved about this was because it wasn't just African American history. I like the storytelling, and it kind of draws into what I am drawn to when it comes to history, telling the story of others, looking at an event and understanding that there were people who lived in that moment, people who experienced things, and there's a story there. And when we squelch that story, when we say, no, this one doesn't matter, but we'll talk about this, then what you're pretty much saying is you're dismissing this story. And I know for me, for example, I love Holocaust history, and when I say love, I enjoy learning about it so much in all aspects. It's hard history. It's difficult. But the story needs to be told. The story needs to be told. And the same way it needs to be told and shared and reflected upon, then so our Native American brothers and sisters, our Black history. I didn't just show up here in this country. I have a story by virtue of my being here, right? My ancestors were brought to this country, and that led to my being here today in the year 2022. It didn't spontaneously happen. So when we dismiss some parts of history for the good parts, if you will, or the safe parts, then we do a disservice to future generations. I have grandchildren now. I want them to know all of our history. History isn't pretty. History is truth. It's what happened. It's fact. It's what happened. So we have to tell the story, and by cherry picking what we think my grandchildren should know, then we're doing nothing. And I think there's a reason why we keep cycling through these topical issues over and over and over. You know, I'm in my 50s, and I see this over and over, and it happens every, 5 to 6, 7 years or so, and we see it again. Why? Because it hasn't been addressed.
Well, you talk about it being a disservice to future generations. I mean, just even saying we, it does a disservice to we in the present.
Yes.
To not have we represented as more than just one version and one understanding.
Absolutely.
Right? If we are going to be a we, then we have to have, some understanding of where we all come from and not just any one perspective.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why I think I enjoy history. I enjoy filmmaking, because I think it can actually present a story in a way where it gets you thinking, and then it makes you wonder, and then it makes you take the steps to say, I want to know more, right? And so it can challenge you. I know that some parts of the film was probably difficult for some, where it made you uncomfortable in your seat and just know, but if this is one slice of history, of our U.S. history, then let it be told. Let's talk about it. Walk away from it, reflect on it, and say, wow. And you think about people who went on to become, the black cowboys in the West, and who did so many amazing, there's some great stories of black cowboys. So one of my favorites is Wild Bill Pickett, who was right there in Fort Worth, and they have a monument in his honor because he was just so unbelievably gifted at just anything regarding horses, the West, all of that, and he was just a gifted black horse wrangler, and it was amazing. But I think too is like, don't hide it. Don't hide that history. Put it out there, and then let us be able to look at it and explore it, pick it apart, talk about it, address it, and then we walk away with a little more understanding of who we are. Right? That's what I think needs to be done. So it's one of those things, I think, that it makes it so much, it's very important that we do that.
I mean, is anybody, feel free, if anyone out in the crowd has a question. I could talk to Tina all day, and if you'll let me, I'll just sit here and talk to Tina all day. But does anyone want to chime in? Does anybody have a question? Am I not updating here? Alex, somebody just posted that somebody waved to Slido. Am I not getting the questions? Yes, go ahead.
I have one.
Sure.
And actually, she'll probably read this. Do you see any comparisons between this film and Netflix, The Harder They Fall? Have you seen that?
No, I've not seen it.
It's a wonderful film, and one of the things, matter of fact, when Chanel and I were talking about programming this, I said that one of the things that makes this film incredibly relevant is The Harder They Fall. Because it really is, if I had to pick a historical kind of film parallel, it's The Wild Bunch told from the black perspective. And so it's a new telling of that hyper-violent Western that deals with both depictions of race and violence in really meaningful ways.
Yes.
And actually, too, you were talking about that you like spaghetti Western.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that implication, and I think people should.
Oh, very good.
It's on Netflix.
It's going in the queue.
Yeah.
It's going in the queue, along with my others.
It was one of those pandemic films that hit that was like, oh, thank you, because this is a lot of fun. But yeah, it really does. It pulls on that kind of absurdity of violence thread that comes through in The Wild Bunch and stuff like that, while also calling back to like things like comedy, right?
Yeah.
Which is one of the things I really enjoy about this film is we tend to think about the Western as very straightforward, very stoic, very kind of, that procedural, taking over the West storytelling. And this has, this is the precursor to buddy comedy to a certain extent, right?
Really, it really is. It really is. I love their interaction, and you can see because they were already great friends by this point. So they played off each other so well, the way they would look, and it was just amazing to see, for sure.
Oh, the corner of Harry Belafonte's eye, the side eye Harry Belafonte that you get in this movie, where it's just so funny.
Absolutely.
Just the look he has to give is so funny.
Yes, it plays really well, for sure.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Others, does anybody have a question? Yes.
I have a question. It's just a comment. There's this series on Netflix, the history of black film.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just seen maybe 5 episodes. And it starts with Hattie McDaniel's
Yes,
appearance.
yes,
And the premise, you could, after a while, you realize, and of course it's explained very, extremely well, how at first, the characters, black characters are just kind of caricatures, and they have absolutely no, actors have nothing to say about the role. But over time, until the present, and they present all the different kinds of films from to the present. I've gotten as far as Spike Lee's film,
yes,
where finally there's control of the story, the characters, what the message, the money, just the production, everything.
absolutely.
So not just the history of actors,
Yeah,
black acting and black film, but the control of it.
yes.
And controlling the message.
Very good. I totally agree. And I'll tell you something, Hattie McDaniel was actually one of my favorite actresses. And it's so, when you watch Gone with the Wind and you see her, how she's portrayed it all, right? I actually read her autobiography, or her biography, and I felt it was brilliant because it actually told her story about her activism, how she actually used her name to help others, to help other black actors find parts and to navigate their way through this, segregation and everything else that was taking place. And she used her name and her position to help others. And also with what was going on in the South, she put her money in places to help, especially when you think about the NAACP and what was happening during that time with the voices that were coming out, writing about what was taking place in the South against Black Americans. So if you've never read her story, I highly recommend it. It's really good.
So my phone is updating now. So someone in the audience, I think Beth here, would like to know, did Harry Belafonte do any more movies with Sidney Poitier?
It was Harry Belafonte Productions you said in the beginning.
Yes. And they actually,
More movies, not with Sidney, but just anyone, what did Harry, what did that do? What did he do with the production?
he actually had a hand with doing some smaller films, but he actually went into this was maybe one of his, he did a few more films after Buck and the Preacher, but he used his voice it's only been recently we've not seen much of him, but for activism, he was very much in human rights, a human rights activist, and really put his name out there to call attention what was happening in global, especially when it came to global atrocities and this sort of thing. And he would probably be in his late 90s now.
Well, and it's Harry Belafonte is one of those people that we don't necessarily always reference him in the same conversation of all of those people that we should, in terms of musician, in terms of actor, and like like everybody wants to turn to a Dean Martin and say the multi-threat, but I mean, producer, musician, all of these things were, he was just an overall incredible artist that, and oftentimes doesn't get as much recognition for the many, because everybody has kind of a different path to Harry Belafonte, right?
Absolutely.
Everybody kind of knows this piece of Harry Belafonte or that piece, and we don't always know the whole picture of what an incredibly talented and business acumen he had.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth telling that for Buck and the Preacher, it started out with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, and Harry Belafonte was the person who really kind of pushed this film to happen and take place, and they had a different actor or director. And the gentleman who directed Pelham 1, 2, 3, that's also a really great film starring Walter Matthau. But the director, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, they had a problem with the way he was telling the story. meaning the voice of the people, the actors, right? In particular, the black actors, and they felt like it wasn't going in the direction they wanted. The director ended up leaving, and Harry Belafonte told Sidney Poitier to step in and just say, "Why don't you do it?" And Sidney Poitier said, "I've never directed." He said, "Well, you'll be okay. Just go ahead and start doing it." But they didn't tell the film studio.
The money.
And it wasn't until they pretty much said, "Well, he's just kind of stepping in because the director," and they kind of took cover for him. And then next thing you know, when they found out, they just said, "You know what?" When they saw the work that Sidney Poitier had already done, they said, "Go ahead and let him finish." And so that was all Harry Belafonte really steering this to get Sidney Poitier in that position to tell the story, to make sure the story is told correctly.
Yeah.
So I thought that was something, and this was back in the 70s that was happening. He had that sort of influence to make something like that happen.
Well, and it's amazing because, going back to our conversation about blaxploitation, that you're right, that so much of blaxploitation was because the people behind the scenes, not on the screen, were telling the story, and they didn't have that voice.
Absolutely.
And so much of this is directed by the voice of that. Matter of fact, there's a question here. Independent and even mainstream African-American cinema from the 60s and 70s is getting harder to find and watch. If you agree, why do you think that is?
I'd like to know what the speaker, what the person is asking here. Harder to watch because...
It's harder to find these kinds of movies.
We're talking about finding them. You're absolutely right. Correct. And that is difficult because I know from, like I said, I was a kid, and my husband and I, we actually have a shared love of those good old films, right? Because we would go to, he went when he was a kid to the Rialto, and I did, and it was just normal. You'd see it in the big letters, Superfly, Cleopatra Jones and lights, and we said, we're going to the movies. It was great. And I think it's part of the people who find them in today's, the way we look at them with 2022 eyes, and we see the problems, right, from our taste, as opposed to the period. If you were just to carve it out and say, stop right here. Now, think about the context of, meaning what was taking place during this time, that this story is being told during this period, right? And if we could see that, and unfortunately what happens, they're almost buried. The storytelling is buried as a result. I wonder if we could actually take a genre and then put it in subcategories almost, where you can say, this is, yes, it's probably not to your liking if we look at what was taking place back in the 70s, or if you saw that there were women who were being misused and abused, and they were, for heaven's sakes, the drug use, everything else, that we would frown upon today. We would frown on that. But is it still worth sharing the story? Can we still watch it? Understanding that it was someone's vision, that they said, this is a story that I'm going to tell. And is it worth, rather than hiding it, maybe we should start to have a conversation about sharing the story, putting it out there, and letting people find it. Let people find it.
I'm going to cede the ground to the film genre expert in the room and not try and speak about genre in front of him. But one of the things I will say is that, one of the things that this does, this kind of environment where we have this moment, is it does let the film become the beginning of the conversation, right?
Yes.
And I think that that's really important with those kinds of films that you're talking about, is that showing a film like that isn't closed. It's not the end of what we're doing. It's the beginning of the conversation that we're having.
There you go.
Is there...
Yeah, in regard to the question that the person asked, I would tend to think that it has a lot to do with distribution and distributing companies, that a lot of those films kind of didn't get sold to another distribution company. So they just kind of like, acquiring dust, so to speak. And I don't know that anybody's really interested enough in, primarily because of money. I mean, who's the audience?
Oh,
right?
sure, yeah.
Oh no, we're going to start me down a critique of capitalism. I need to get under the table. No, I think you're right. But one of the things that's truly interesting about this is the medium itself, right? Because the fact is that we want to resurrect old books. We want to resurrect, but it's the credibility of film that these films that, you're right, are dusted and put on a shelf. Where is the moment to say we need to have these things restored and be part of our history, be part of our conversation?
Absolutely.
Because I think that, one of the things that you've done really eloquently in this conversation is talk about the complexity with which we have to approach this period of black cinema, right? There are incredibly problematic depictions, and there are also incredibly empowering depictions, and there's no, the blaxploitation, just that name of that genre gives this kind of negative connotation to these films, whereas I don't think you can end with just a negative connotation. You've got to have the conversation about how these things were at times incredibly empowering and at times incredibly frustrating as a depiction.
Absolutely, totally agree. And I do understand, and I do see the impact, but I think the people who have the opportunity to restore, because these films were almost crudely made. My husband and I, we actually watched one with recently with Pam Grier, who is just phenomenal. She's a great actress today. I like her as an actress, but watching just the raw footage of it was just so crudely made. And I'm just watching it, and I said, wow, but it would be wonderful if these types of films were restored to the way they were supposed to be and leave them as is, just let them be what they're going to be. And maybe the Library of Congress will say, you know what, let's just house them here. Let's just do that, because they are part of cinema. And I don't know if we can look at one, and if we look at, say, The Birth of a Nation, right? And I've watched it, and I made it a point of wanting to watch it, and it was maybe a decade ago or so, and watching it, and I just looked and I said, this is history. This is what was going on during this period. This is history. Does it mean that I shouldn't see it? I don't want to see it? I don't hide it? Or do we bring it out, look at it, break it apart, look at our nation's history during this time period, understand why at the time President Woodrow Wilson said it was the best film ever, and understand even what he was doing and how did that impact like some of the laws that were being enacted and everything else, connecting those dots, man. I mean, understanding it. It was propaganda. That's what it was. And but it happened. It happened. Well, so let's pick it apart. Let's do that.
And it's so funny you bring that up because, from my background, because I have these parallel tracks, right? I teach television and film production, but I also am a rhetoric scholar. And one of the things that is always so interesting to me is Birth of a Nation is almost unproblematically taught in production, right? Because it's this incredible moment where the film goes from being that 10-minute thing to this blown up, and it's edited sequences, and it plays with time, and it really does a lot of things that have their roots in that film that last to filmmaking today. And we talk about that as if we can talk about it without the problematic story that is being presented in that film. Whereas then we go over here and have these conversations in critical thinking classrooms and media studies classrooms, and it's like, whoa. But it's almost as if those conversations get separated out, where we talk about this being great filmmaking, and say what you will, it's crude filmmaking, it's long filmmaking for sure.
It sure is.
But we almost don't teach filmmakers this part, right? Which is the fact is your story has, the things you do have impacts that exist beyond your narrative. And so, this is, oftentimes when people are reviewing for Hobnobbin, and we still have these conversations of, do filmmakers not understand the impact of their story beyond just the story they are telling and the influence it can have on people who watch it?
Absolutely. That's a good point. Very good point. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you make an excellent point. I feel like it's like period. Just because I think that's what we should be doing. We should be merging and talking and picking apart the cinema, all of it, not just what feels right and has a nice comfort level for us, but also the ones that just, this is difficult to watch. This is hard to watch, but understanding the why Why is it difficult to watch? Maybe we should start having more conversations to discuss this and to really kind of decimate it and be able to say, here's where we are today. How do we move forward from this point and moving into the future for my grandchildren, for example? You know what I mean? So the world is a little better for them, right? So we don't have to keep recycling the same conversation because there are no resolutions. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And, one of the things that, and like I said, I could talk all night, and certainly I'm not going to require everyone to be here from all my conversations. But one of the things I do want to say is I think this last point we're making here is really important for who we are. And what I mean by that is Cinema Center. This really is what we hope to be a space to have these conversations, to bridge these moments of talking about production, but also talking about, I hearken back to the conversation we had with the director for The Killing of Two Lovers. And one of the things I had a problem with some of his depictions of the characters in his film. And it was a wonderful opportunity to sit here virtually and have a conversation with this director of this film and say, hey, don't you think that having these depictions in your film perpetuates stereotypes of this? And to have him go, I understand that critique, but that's not what I was going for, but have the moment where we can have that reflection.
Yes.
And then have the audience get to be a part of that conversation and
Yes.
really get to be involved in a discussion about what it's like, to make a film, because making a film is hard.
Yes.
But also to try and understand the lasting impact that stories have on audiences.
Yes.
And so I really appreciate you not only selecting the film, but willing to come and be subject of my interrogation. I did not bring my hot lights,
Thank
but
you. Low lights. This is nice.
but I really want to thank you for sitting with us. Did anybody have any last questions before we wrap up for the evening?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, and let us give a big round of applause to Tina for being willing to sit with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. Once again, thanks to Chanel and Cambry and Alex for all the work that they do, and we hope you have a wonderful Friday night and rest of your weekend. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Thank you.